my honor and pleasure to be with you all today to talk about healthy planning and how to incorporate employee input and wellness into your strategies. And as we start today, I just want to ensure that you all have a quick idea of the background that I bring. I know my bio's out there, but I was in federal government for about 24 years. And then since then, I've been in the private sector as a consultant and have worked both in or with federal, state and local government, as well as nonprofits, academic institutions, and philanthropic institutions. So I've kind of been around, seen it all, done a lot of planning work for agencies. So when I was in federal government, a lot of my responsibility, besides evaluation performance measurement, was around planning or contributing to strategic planning. And from that experience, just gained a lot of insights into how to make strategic planning better, how to make it healthy for the organization or to create a healthy organization, and dare I say, to make it actually enjoyable. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. So the first thing, though, is I'd like to get a sense of who's here, and we're going to do a poll that we're going to put up here about which of the following best describes your role in your organization. And so as you are entering in your role in the organization, one of the important things is that no matter what role that you have, you definitely can and should be contributing to planning within your organization. And what we'll be also talking about here is the ability to plan at any level, because it's important for any level to have the plans that it needs in order to help move forward. The other thing I'd like you to do is remember those roles, because in one of the breakouts, I'm going to ask you to kind of talk from that perspective in your breakout groups. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end. And just so you know who's here, I just wanted to share this with you. So good to know that we have a lot of team members who are here online, and as well as quite a variety. So we'll go forward and talk about healthy planning. Now, they do tell presenters that you have about 10 minutes of undivided attention, and it's actually less online before people's minds start to wander. And so let me give you what I would really like you to take away from today's session. And these are the high-level concepts. The first is it's much more difficult to succeed in whatever you're doing without planning. If you don't have a plan, you are very limited in what you can do. And we'll talk about that. When you put a plan together, it's important that, especially for those of you in the public sector, that you plan for improvement and that the plan is not about just doing more of the same. If you tend to plan just to keep the status quo, over time, what that does is it will actually create a decline in your organization. So as your environment is changing, if you're not adapting to that or adapting to new conditions, new information, eventually what you will do is actually put yourself in a very dire situation. The organization needs to have a clearly defined vision of its future. And that means being able to identify, what does success look like? Can we describe it? Is it a clear picture of where we're trying to go? Probably the second most common issue that I hear when I go in and work with organizations, and I have worked with all cabinet level departments, about 130 agencies, in the federal government, again, as well as state and local and nonprofit organizations and academic institutions. But probably the second most important comment I hear, especially when we're dealing with dysfunction, is we don't know what the vision is. We don't know what our priorities are or what we're working toward. And so that's essential to give you the direction that you want to be going and to communicate that effectively. Next, the organization expects an inclusive, comprehensive, and transparent process that is focused on both individual and organizational well-being. Employees come to the organization as persons, and they identify at various points within the organization, both at the organizational level, they identify at the functional level, and then as an individual. They all have goals and values, and we need to ensure that those are aligned with the organization. And when an organization focuses on its well-being, which is inclusive of the individual's well-being, organizations become much healthier. And finally, customers and employees of organizations want to have well-being, and so they want to incorporate wellness into the plans as we go forward and move to identify, again, what is our strategy? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, the wisdom of the Dakota Indians that has been passed down from generation to generation states that when you discover you are riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. However, in government, we like to believe that we have far more advanced strategies for riding dead horses, such as buying a stronger whip, asserting that this is the way we have always ridden this horse, arranging to visit other sites to benchmark how they ride dead horses, providing additional training to increase our riding knowledge, skills, and abilities, outsourcing to private contractors to see if they can ride the dead horse cheaper, harnessing several dead horses together to increase the speed, declaring that as the dead horse does not have to be fed, it is less costly, carries lower overheads, and therefore contributes substantially more to the bottom line of the economy than do some other horses, or forming quality circles to find other uses for dead horses, commissioning a study to identify ways to improve dead horses through incremental enhancements such as adding wheels, rewriting the expected performance requirements for all horses, and of course, promoting the dead horse to a supervisory position. So we want you to make sure that you're not pursuing any of these dead horses. And so we want to talk about how is strategy used. And let me just give you some data about strategy and strategic planning. Now, this data comes from the Balanced Scorecard Collaborative, which is an association of organizations that use the Balanced Scorecard as their basic strategy and performance framework. And from a study they did that included both public and private sector organizations, they found that 95% of the workforce does not understand their organization's strategy. So if you think about that, 95% of your organization may not actually know what you're trying to actually accomplish or the ways in which you're trying to accomplish it. I know from my experience in the federal government, on a yearly basis, I would have mandatory training in ethics. I would have it in cybersecurity and physical security, computer rules and IT things. But never once in my career did I actually have a mandatory meeting to talk about what is our mission and strategy, or what are we trying to do to accomplish it. In that study, they also found that 90% of organizations fail to successfully execute against their strategy. If you're familiar with John Kotter from Harvard, who works in the leadership and change management areas. From studies he's done, he has found that only 5% of strategic initiatives succeed. 86% of leadership teams spend less than 1 hour per month reviewing progress against their strategy. And this isn't hard to understand. If you think about, your typical staff meeting, what's discussed in the staff meeting? Usually it's an information dump. Sometimes there's a discussion of issues, but are you talking about the progress you're making? What are our performance metrics telling us? Are we seeing and looking at what are the resources that we need to have to ensure that we're being successful? How are we aligning our strategy with the mission? Probably not. Another thing they found in the study, 75% of senior leadership teams do not have consensus regarding their organization's value proposition. Meaning, if you think about it, that your executive team doesn't agree or doesn't hold the same assumptions about why the organization's in business, what are the important priorities of the organization, what are the areas that really focus, that take the focus or need the focus to achieve operational excellence and high performance. And finally, 65% of organizations do not tangibly link their daily activity to the strategy, which may mean that there's a lot of activity happening, but very little impact occurring. And just one more, this was a study from Dr. Pete Hammett from the Center for Creative Leadership. And again, I just pulled some questions that, in that study from the strategy area. And I want you to look at the data here. The people in charge here have a clear vision on where we are going. Well, 80% of the executives agreed or strongly agreed. Only 59% of the employees. The next question, a visible, clearly stated strategic planning process is used to guide future actions. Only 51% of executives, 36% of employees. And finally, new projects here are usually well planned. Less than half of the executives and less than a third of the employees agreed. Now, there are two major things that I want you to see in this data. First is, if you look at that first question, it's about having that vision. Where are we going? What is the direction? What are we hoping to achieve? The second question, where there's a significant drop-off in agreement, is that a visible, clearly stated planning process is used. Meaning, okay, we understand that if we understand the vision, do we have a plan to get there? And then finally, from that plan, how are the projects planned? And again, we see that they're not well planned and probably then not well executed. So how do we change that? How can we, I'm sorry, let me go back. And the other thing that I wanted you to see here is that look at the difference between the executives and the employees. The employees don't see it the same way. And so for any of you who are, in your career on your rise to leadership, I want you to always remember that, you saw things differently when you were an employee. Now, yes, executives may have access to information that employees don't have, but how is that shared? How is it communicated? How can we bring and raise and increase the employee's view and agreement to these areas? So the main question then is, why plan? And why do we plan? Well, it's to bring that vision, the plan, and the execution together so that we can be more effective. It also, though, allows us to communicate within the organization as well as outside of the organization. One of the really important things to understand about plans or strategic plans is that they are also communication documents, because they describe who you are as an organization, what you're trying to achieve, and how. So we're going to go into breakout rooms in just a moment, but I have a first question for you that I'd like for you to put into the chat feature. And so before we do this, I just want to explain that I'm going to ask you this question. I want you to type your answer into the chat, but don't send it yet. And we're going to do what's called a chat storm. And so I'll count down, and when I say go, then send your answer. So the question is, when you hear the term strategic planning, what thoughts or feelings do you or your organization experience? So I'm going to give you just a moment here to write your answer. All right, so a lot of input, things like lots of time, lots of meetings, painful, make work, we don't do it well, it's difficult to get agreement, it'll never happen, we'll never use it, looks good on paper, right? It's annoying. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and break into breakout groups, and I'm going to give you another question in your breakout group. And so our AU hosts are going to send you to those groups. We're going to give you about 4 minutes to talk. And what I'd like you to do is be ready to share your ideas when we come back. So the question that you're going to go to your breakout groups with is, why does strategic planning tend to evoke such negative reactions? And again, what I want you to do is think about this from your perspective and your role. Why do you think strategic planning maybe isn't useful, or again, has negative reactions from the role that you have in the organization?
Okay, Ted, I think everyone is out of their breakout room, so you can go ahead and get started.
Right, thank you. So would anyone like to kind of share what your group talked about? Any particular things that popped up for you? You can go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll get you on. All
Hi,
right.
Ted. We have a raised hand from Sean McGruder. Sean McGruder, we have unmuted you.
Gritter, okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks, Sean.
Sure. So I guess what I would say is a lot of times it's the case that leaders have an idea of what they want to do in advance, and
Hi, Pat,
the
and then Tracy.
the actual effort that's put into building the strategic plan, you don't get the real value from the team members who are charged with doing it, because the leadership already knows what they want to do, and they're just looking for that to be validated.
Okay. Great, thank you. How about Teresa?
Yeah, so I think that strategic planning is incredibly valuable. The challenge is, and especially in the IT community, that things evolve at such a rapid pace that a 5-year strategic plan becomes obsolete very quickly. The idea, though, that there is a central point where goals and initiatives and priorities can be articulated and accessible to everyone in the organization helps people to set priorities and really know what leadership is thinking. But at the same time, we need to move past this idea of a single static strategic plan and move into something more dynamic. So as priorities change, as technology changes, and as other issues and concerns emerge, it can be updated, and it's no easy feat to do so. But really, the value in a strategic plan is such that I think it's worth both the time and resource investment.
Great, thank you. And couldn't agree more. And we'll talk about those things. Tracy?
Yes, I echo what the last two people said. And also, sometimes if you have a culture of, you know, a need to know, you only share or communicate information on a need to know basis, a lot of military organizations are like that, then people really have no visibility around what you're doing or why you're doing it. And the thought process is kind of like lost on them. So then they feel like they're just being asked to bless something that they really don't know much about. And waiting till the last minute to get someone's input when the culture all along has not been one to get, you know, inclusive is kind of, it lacks a genuine, people don't trust that. So now you have an issue with trust and buy-in and all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I think we'll go with Eric G.
Thanks for getting us started, Ted. A couple of things that came to mind, I just jotted them down real quick, is one of the things I found from my own experience, 20 years in the government, is nobody fully understands the value of strategic planning. We saw from those responses, it's like, oh my gosh, the first thought is negative. So nobody really understands why it's being done. The other thing I found is it is not messaged well from leadership. They give you highfalutin all hands descriptions of it, but they don't make it real for people. They don't give concrete examples. So it's not really messaged well or understood or presented to staff in a very meaningful way. And then lastly, people don't always understand how what they do on a regular basis ties into this plan and how they can impact that plan. I'm off doing my work here, and you've got this stupid meeting with this planning stuff, whatever. So there's a huge disconnect in that. So those are some of the thoughts I had.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and so thank you everyone who participated there and shared your thoughts or your group's thoughts. Those are all true. You know, I see those things all the time. And I thought one of the things that all of you hit upon, and Tracy, I think, actually used the word. So why does this happen? A lot of it is related to what is the culture in your organization and what will it put up with. And so culture is, what does this group value? What does it believe? What are the acceptable behaviors, the language, the stories, and the results and history of the organization? And does it promote the idea of planning? And there's all kinds of examples, you know, I could give you about organizations that don't have good cultures. But just, you know, a couple of things that I've run across that I thought were a bit humorous or sad and pathetic, depending on your perspective, was working with one organization in which one of the key people who was supposed to be in the strategic planning would always find out when the strategic planning meetings were going to occur, and then would schedule other meetings to be in, so that that person he would never attend. The other one, a colleague of mine ran across, was that when that organization was talking about strategic planning, one of the people who was an executive responsible for strategic planning, said that they would rather go to a root canal than go to a strategic planning meeting. And why do we have those kind of views? Often, I think it is because we don't know, or organizations don't know, how to incorporate the viewpoints, the ideas of their staff, of their customers, of their stakeholders into the process. Or, you know, are overconfident in their own abilities just to do it, or they have a culture that doesn't see planning as important. That, again, this is the make work or busy work, either that we have to comply with, or does it really make any difference? So we want to look at, how do we create plans that move an organization forward, help it to be healthy, and then has the buy-in and the follow-up to actually achieve the results that you want to achieve. So just a couple of points. If an organization doesn't plan, it can have a lot of problems. Typically what we see is kind of at the, I guess I would say most benign level, is there's a lot of activity, but little impact. I mentioned that before, that there's a lot of work going on, but if it's not aligned to achieving and being coordinated to achieve any particular goals, and it's just kind of lined up to a goal on paper, and people aren't looking at it to see, is it actually progressing us to that goal? You can get a lot of activity, and this tends to then break down into organizations as a lot of people having pet projects that or pet programs that, again, don't really contribute. They may be good in and of themselves, but when you're looking at what are we trying to accomplish together, they may not lead that way. As organizations fail to plan, we also see that they become subject to outside influences and often will find themselves in situations where they will have fewer and less desirable options. If they're not aware of what's going on, what changes are occurring, what's happening in the external environment, what's happening with other similar organizations, what's happening internally, they may find themselves in a position that they don't have the freedom or flexibility to make some choices and actually become much more reactive. And that kind of goes into this next one, the constant catch up. Organizations that don't plan effectively are very often in the process of always putting out fires, always playing catch up, always behind. And when that tends to happen, that can lead to what I call sector irrelevance. Organizations that no longer are relevant or either have a seat at the table for what they're trying to work on. One example I had was working with an agency that had really kind of stopped planning and just did a lot of activities. And when we actually had started looking at what's going on in the environment, the systems that they work in, what we found was a number of nonprofit organizations were now doing the same things and doing them better. And instead of people coming to the government to look for that particular service, they were now going outside to other organizations who were doing it and were actually using the information that had been generated by the government. And to the point where this agency took a 20% cut in its staffing because it wasn't able to demonstrate the kind of value that it used to. Now, on the other hand, if you do plan, one of the great things is you can avoid compliance problems, and this can do with bad publicity, fines, or other issues that come with not complying, because you can focus on what are the changes in our regulations or legislation or kind of rules of the road that we have to adjust to. Again, how do we prepare for that? Or how, as we think that there are things being discussed, how do we prepare for those? Planning definitely helps you reduce wasted time and money. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the more time that is spent on planning and clarity around plans and implementation, the actual less work or less rework, I should say, is done by organizations. Organizations become better prepared for change. And so as change is occurring and you're making adjustments to the environment, to the outside world, or to internal things happening, you're better able to have a focused approach and ideas on where to go. It's also a way to bring customers and stakeholders together so that you can get on common ground, have common understanding about what it is that you're all trying to achieve. What is it that you want to have happen? What is that desired future? And good planning over time allows you to sell, and I call it here future expansion ideas or plans, but really this is about what more can we do? How can we be even better? What is it that we might need to focus on that we haven't focused on in the past that actually helps us create more value for our customer base or stakeholders, or again, in the public sector for citizens or our intended audiences? So overall, planning is important because it does a number of things for an organization. It can help set priorities. It focuses our energy and resources. It strengthens our operations, ensures that employees and stakeholders are working together toward common goals. It gets agreement about what are our outcomes, what is it that we're supposed to be doing. And it can help us provide a way and a framework to assess and adjust the direction when the environment or the outside world is changing. And so the reason that, this kind of approach and a healthy approach, what kind of got me into it was some work I did with a couple of agencies. So I'm going to tell you a couple of quick stories here. For agency number one, and of course, unfortunately, I can't tell you who it is because of confidentiality reasons. But for agency number one, it was a medium-sized agency in a large department. And what they were facing was the threat of being incorporated into another agency in that department. And as we were working with them, what we found was one of the big issues was that they were dealing with outdated legislative mandates. So this was in the mid-2000s, but the most recent update to their legislation, they were a regulatory agency. The most recent update to that legislation was from 1976. So if you can think of all the changes that have occurred between 1976, if you're that old, and the mid-2000s, that was a huge barrier for them about what they could do. And I think over time, they had kind of had this culture of learned helplessness. What we got right away was, well, no, that's legislation. We can't change legislation. There's nothing that we can do about it. And so even communicating about how the lack of update was affecting their ability to work wasn't being done very effectively. It was also a very heavily siloed organization, and there was a lot of overlap and duplication of some things. But what that heavy silo structure led to was each element having its own procedures, its own policies about the same things. And in some cases, those were actually contradictory. And so the organization was not in a position to achieve its mission as effectively as it could. After the strategic planning process, they were actually able to look at two separate goals that they had, and those goals had been actually designed by functional focus. But as they went through the process and there was more input into it, they found that there was far more similarity between the goals than differences, and they were able to join those into one, which allowed then for cross-fertilization and cross-training within the organization. So it allowed for potentially more mobility of the staff between elements of the organization. They moved away from having only output and activity-based performance measures to now outcome-based measures, knowing how to assess what difference they were making. And is anybody better off because of their work? They actually were able to incorporate employee improvement initiatives, and those became more prioritized. So instead of it being kind of the forgotten thing, or as we get to it, or if there's extra funding, there actually was a dedicated focus on initiatives to benefit employees, both professional development and personal areas. They also were able to align their goals to the departmental levels and departmental initiatives so that they could demonstrate what it is, again, what value that they were contributing to the organization as a whole. And it allowed them to come up with a planned approach to get a legislative update. Second agency it's a tiny agency, but it was in a large bureau or agency within a department. They had extremely poor relations with their parent agency. In fact, at best, they were ignored. At worst, they were sabotaged by their parent agency. And eventually, that also came to, is there possible elimination or consolidation into somewhere else? And the options at that time were ones that would really drastically shift their mission and actually not be helpful. When I came in, they had in 10 years, 5 failed planning attempts. And so, believe me, strategic planning was not thought of as useful or helpful in any way. And the other thing that they were going through was there had been a lot of organizational trauma within the organization. Employees with definitely very hurt feelings, damaged between different sections of the organization, ones in which the agency and this group of people really did not want to work together. After the strategic planning process, they had a much more reinvigorated mission, and there was stronger alignment between their functional areas to contribute to the mission. They also had a new vision, one that was aspirational and exciting for them, one that actually gave them a stronger role to contribute to higher level goals than what they had been focused on. The process also, again, allowed them to align their goals to the parent agency and the department, and again, show how they were contributing to those goals. And by bringing in their parent agency and department reps into the process, actually helped improve relations. And then the parent agency and the department were able to see, oh no, this group does contribute, and look what they're trying to do and how they help and what is their role in that assistance to our larger goals. Much better articulation of their value proposition, basically meaning they were able to talk about why they brought value, how they brought it, what value they did create. The process also allowed for improved trust between individuals and healing from the organizational trauma that had happened. Some of that trauma had included, I'll just say, very, very bad leadership or poor leadership that was exceptionally damaging, but also other situations that had occurred that had never really been dealt with. And what it generated was active leadership by the workforce to steward the values and culture of the organization, to the point that there was someone, one of the employees, who really was not ever that involved with the organization, actually was the one who started saying, hey, we have these values in the organization, what are we doing about them? And actually became the values coordinator for the organization, and was the person doing a check-in to see, are we living the values? How are we doing? Is leadership living the values? And so these organizations both came out with a stronger sense of purpose, improved trust between one another, and better ability to, again, articulate what they were trying to accomplish and how their daily work figured into it. So what were the actions that we took to get there? There were 3 major things that we looked at. One was innovative planning focus. The second was incorporation of wellness as a strategic factor into their plans. And then the inclusion of the workforce in the planning. And so I'm going to talk about these 3 things quickly. So just to give you, again, make sure that we're on the same page here, just some planning basics. When we talk about planning, it really is taking us from where are we now to where do we want to be. And how do we get there? The plan is about how do we get there. And so kind of at the top there, you'll see terms that are familiar for those who do strategic planning. What's our mission? How does that relate to an environmental scan, or what do we know that's going on out there in our strategic environment, in the landscape? What are changes in the political, economic, social, cultural, and technology areas that may affect us? How are we prepared for that? And that's a PEST analysis. SWOT analysis stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So strengths and weaknesses are internal. What are the strengths of the organization? What are its weaknesses, or as I like to refer to them, opportunities for improvement? And then externally, what are the opportunities? What are changes that are happening that will help advance who we are and what we're doing? And what are threats? What are the threats to our survival? What are the threats to our ability to achieve outcomes? And looking at the mission and the vision, and where we then want to be, the vision, where we want, what's our desired future, we can develop the goals, objectives, and strategies of how to get there. And then, of course, all of these things, though, are seen through the lens of our culture. What are our values, our beliefs, the stories, behaviors, our roles, and results? Now, one of the things that has changed in strategic planning over the last several years, and in the last conversation we had, this was described. In the past, strategic planning, one of the reasons I think it did not do well was in the past, the process tended to be very top-down, tended to be very centralized, was highly formal, and it was static, meaning that you created a plan and that plan sat for 5 years. What's occurred now, and where we see successful and healthy strategic planning, is that a process that's used is participative, meaning it's inclusive. It has a lot more input into it from the workforce, from leaders, from customers, from stakeholders, suppliers, and partners. It's distributed, meaning that there are different groups of people who actually work on the plan and work to achieve what the plan sets out. Typically, it's more informal now because there is a need to update the plan, and so it becomes dynamic. We don't have a plan, let it sit on a shelf for 5 years, and then do the plan again to sit for another 5 years. In the past, a strategic planning process really was focused on the development of the plan, the document itself. Usually plans were about the internal needs and issues and how to correct them. A lot of it was activity-based. What are all the different things that we do, our different processes or outputs? And it was focused on replicating the past. What did we do well, and how do we do that maybe a little better, or how do we keep doing it? Well, now strategic planning, effective strategic planning, is focused on action. It's not so much does the plan look great, and it's what is the action that we're taking. It's focused on who our intended audience is, who are the customers, what are their needs, what is the system that we operate in, and how do we also affect the system. Outcomes based. What is it we're trying to achieve? What are the changes for our internal audience or our external audiences that need to occur to get to that impact, to know that we're really making a difference? And it's about a defined, well-articulated, desired future. Who is it that we're trying to be, and what contribution will that have to the world? And so when you boil it down, there's really 5 critical success factors for strategic planning. And when these are not all in place, you'll have other issues. So those 5 are having a vision, clearly articulated, having that systems perspective, being aware of what is the system or the environment we operate in, having participative involvement and inclusion, then having the resources to actually implement those things, and then having an action plan. So instead of just high-level goals, really having plans to say, how are we moving year to year to achieve those goals? You have to have all those things in place to be successful. When there's not a vision, typically what that leads to is a lot of confusion in the organization. When there's not systems perspective, where you don't have the input from staff or from the stakeholders, you'll end up with blind spots. You'll be unprepared for things that change in the environment. If you don't have involvement, you'll have resistance to the plan. You'll have resistance to those outcomes or new directions or innovation. When you don't have the resources, that leads to frustration because there's a promise there, but if you can't help get there, that creates anxiety and other issues for staff. And then finally, if there's not an action plan, lots of false starts. And so as we have these things, here's just a chart, and again, you have this in your material, that helps you, gives you a sense of what's a healthy version of these things, and when do you need to kind of get a checkup on those areas. For example, I had worked with one agency who had a massive organizational transformation, but the vision was only described as improved customer service. It wasn't detailed enough. It didn't give a picture, or it kind of allowed everybody to interpret it that the same way, and people still weren't in agreement that some of their customer service was bad or needed improvement. And so if a vision is not described well, or again, if it's just do more of the same, you're going to flatline your organization because other things around you change. And so this is just a way to look at, again, where you might need a checkup in your planning process. So the characteristics of healthy planning is you have a clear future-focused direction. It's about moving forward. Where do we want to be? How do we want to be in the future? It's customer-driven or citizen-driven. You really have identified well who is your intended audience that you're trying to influence and affect. And it's about, our activities are focused on helping them achieve their outcomes. Our outcomes, our results, our value is about what's of value to those audiences, our customers, our stakeholders. There's high involvement. The workforce, the customers, suppliers, partners are involved in providing input into those goals, into those outcomes. Again, it's dynamic, that what you do is you don't allow this plan to sit, but you come back and revisit it throughout its lifetime and make changes according to other changes that are occurring. Now, you may not have it from your leaders, but I give you my permission to go change your plans based on new information. It's also linked to action plans and implementation. So what are our priorities, kind of year by year or quarter by quarter, and how are we going to get there? Who's responsible? It has built-in change management. So if there are major changes introduced, part of the plan is how do we communicate this and work with folks to understand what the change is and help them in both the intellectual, organizational transition as well as the emotional transition that people go through. And importantly, we measure and evaluate the plan. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is take out a piece of paper. I'm going to show you 11 questions and want you to actually assess how well your organization is related to strategic planning and how healthy it may be. So you're going to see 11 questions. For each item or question, I want you to, if you and your organization do this consistently, or you agree with how this is how your organization does it, I want you to give yourself 1 point. For each item that occurs most, but maybe not all of the time, or that you kind of moderately agree with that, yeah, we do this or I do this, give yourself half a point. And then for each item that occurs inconsistently or not at all, or that you disagree with, give yourself 0 points. Okay? here we go. So hopefully you have something to write on and something to write with, and we'll go to the first questions. So first question, I know my organization's vision. So where is it trying to go in the future? So again, give yourself 1 point if this happens consistently, if you strongly agree with this, half a point if you moderately agree, 0 points if you don't agree or your organization doesn't have one. Okay, question number 2. My organization's vision and strategy is communicated frequently throughout the organization. So again, 1 point, half point, or 0. Number 3, I know who my organization's most important customers are. And my organization adapts its efforts to meet different needs and perspectives of different customer segments. So it divides the customer groups. So it's not one big lump group. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next set of questions. So as it plans for the question 5, as it plans for the future, my organization asks for my ideas. So again, 1 if that happens consistently, half if it doesn't, or if it's inconsistent, and 0 if it doesn't happen at all. Number 6, I know the parts of my organization's plans that will affect me and my work. Okay, number 7, I know how to tell if we are making progress on my work group's part of the plan. And number 8, I know how the measures I use in my work fit into the organization's overall measures of improvement. Okay, and then we're going to move to the final questions. I can get everything I need to do my job. So this is a question about, do you get the resources you need? Do you get the time and advice from your leaders that you need? Number 10, I know how my organization as a whole is doing. So again, 1, half, or 0. And I know how my organization's performance compares with other similar organizations. All right. So now what I'd like you to do is count or tally your points. And I'm going to put up a poll that will have a set of ranges in it. And I want you to put in what range your score was in. And I do guarantee this will be the hardest math that we'll do during this session. Okay, so just share the results with you, so you kind of see where those who are able to put their scores in are. So majority of you in the 6 to 7.5 area. Kind of strong there in the middle. It's good. So just to kind of review what those scores meant. If you scored less than 6, it really is imperative that you begin to start changing the way that you're working as soon as possible. And so the advice I'd give you is target those behaviors where you gave yourself the partial credit first. So any of those areas where it was a half point, start working on those and fully embed them into your work or into your processes, your organizations as best you can, or work toward them. And then build on that success by targeting the behaviors where you were unable to give yourself credit. For those of you who scored 6 or higher, you're showing signs of at least some healthy strategic planning. And so what you want to do is set a goal of learning one of those behaviors or incorporating it or 2 of them every year. try to start building. And again, focus on the ones that you gave yourself partial credit for, because those are usually easier wins. And then move to the ones that had no credit. And then for everyone, consider, taking this assessment probably every 6 months to a year. Has it changed? Because depending on the length of your planning process, it's important. What I also, though, strongly encourage you to do is, no matter what level you are in the organization, have plans for your work unit that align up the chain. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out for about 4 minutes again, and I want you to talk about which of the strategically healthy critical success factors is your organization strong in. How does your organization do these well, and where are there opportunities for improvement? So we're going to go ahead and break into groups. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move into the next areas, because what we've talked about is really the foundations for healthy planning. So this is kind of the if we were putting it into a doctor analogy or a health analogy, this is the how do you eat and work out and exercise kinds of things and maintain health. But really, to go the extra mile, to have truly healthy, and as I said earlier, enjoyable strategic planning, there are a couple things that we'll talk about now, and that is having a culture of wellness that applies to the organization, to your customers, to your stakeholders, and certainly to your staff, as well as how to include more voices in the planning process to ensure that they truly understand it. Now, the idea of wellness, there's a lot of research on this, but it basically breaks down into 8 dimensions: physical, emotional, intellectual or mental, purposeful or spiritual, environmental, social, financial, and occupational. And these 8 areas can be further categorized by internal, which means that they deal with the internal state of kind of your body, mind, health, and spirit, and external, which is how someone relates to their external environment, how they relate to the world, and how the world influences them. But each of these, as you combine internal and external, lead to some kind of outcomes. And so when we combine physical, individual physical health with environmental, that leads us to the outcome of health. Emotional and social wellness combined can create happiness. Financial and mental and intellectual can lead us to an outcome of wealth. And I don't mean just financial wealth, but also, wealth of opportunity, thought. And then finally, occupational and spiritual, when those are done well, can lead to a sense of harmony for folks. And so just quickly, I'm going to go through each of these just so you have an understanding of what they are. And again, this is in the materials that you have, so it's good reference for you. So the focus on physical is the well-being of the physical body. And so there are some essential things that you need to do for this. And so what we look at when we incorporate wellness into our strategy is having a strategy for these 8 dimensions. How do we work these with our own folks, our own employees? Is that part of our management excellence to take care of our workforce and our leaders, as well as how do these apply to the intended audiences that we have? And so just some examples of how organizations, even in the public sector, may use these are at the bottom. So, having activity days where, everyone is allowed to go out and, or is encouraged to do different kinds of activities to be healthy. having access to gyms or other forms of fitness, whether on site or through other programs. And at a minimum, information campaigns on health and resource guides on how to stay healthy, how to be healthy. The emotional psychological focuses on coping effectively with life and creating satisfying relationships. And so a lot of this can be around, creating and resilience, practicing emotional intelligence, learning how to cope, learning how to remain calm and centered. And so, where we've seen this show up in organizations and with their intended audiences is providing training and coaching in emotional intelligence and resilience, building accountability partnerships between people in different roles in different functions of an organization. Having proactive employee assistance programs instead of having an employee assistance program that just kind of sits there and waits for someone to self-identify, is again having information and resources available that are communicated to employees on a regular basis. For the intellectual and mental, again, the focus is on recognizing creative abilities, finding ways to expand knowledge and skills. And so part of this is being able to focus on what it is you know and how to master it, how to get better at it. And so again, here, there's training or coaching in the essential skills that we need, or adjacent skills areas, so that we're looking at how to bring a more well-rounded approach to issues. Allowing our employees or others time for learning. One way to do this is consider what's known as the 70-20-10 learning framework, which is 70% of learning occurs on our own. It occurs by people reaching out to different resources to learn about things, giving people an opportunity to do that. 20% is learned socially. That's social interaction between others. So encouraging people from different parts of an organization to get together and actually have facilitated learning. What are you learning in the way that you do things? What might be transferred? And then 10% is in instructional classroom, typical classroom or on learning environments. Having learning programs. I know Treasury and Interior both had or have books and authors come in. EPA, I believe, does. Having free webinars like this one. Share your knowledge back to the organization, the most important thing. If you learn something new that, or learn about a topic that may be really important or just interesting, share it. Get people's reaction to how that might affect how they think about things. One that I found particularly interesting was someone at OPM had come across biomimicry of how organisms mimic things in the environment as they kind of evolve, and brought it into how do we learn? How does an organization learn from this kind of approach? The purposeful spiritual is really focused on expanding your sense of purpose and meaning in life, having something more important than yourself to focus on. And so there's a variety of ways that this can be done. And within organizations, the way that I have seen them work with their employees and again with their customers is trying to align the daily activities directly to the mission or the function of the organization. Employees buy into the mission. It is critical to align that work to what the mission is, what that purpose is, what is the higher calling that people ascribe to at work. Also ask, how will this benefit our customers, our stakeholders, as well as ourselves? Do things like tune into Mindfulness Mondays with Dr. Ruth Zaplin as part of the KEY program. And there's the link, or other similar kinds of things. And make discussion of organizational values as part of your staff meetings. I was fortunate enough to be a member of one organization where our performance appraisal, half of our performance appraisal was actually ratings on how well we were living the company's values. Environmental, that's focused on protecting and improving your personal environment and the health and safety benefits of the organization. That can be physical environment. So, creating, community gardens around the work location. Several agencies have done that. Again, planning for green buildings, energy conservation and efficiency by working with utilities. I know in the state of Virginia, for example, the utility companies there are undergoing huge conservation and energy efficiency programs. Incorporate what we call the triple bottom line thinking into your planning. That is, how is this good for people? How is this good for profit? Again, in the private sector, of course, that's financial profit. In the public sector, that's mission achievement and the planet. Social, very important. Developing a sense of connection and belonging. Having a well-developed support system. So there's some essential things that individuals can do. Give and gain trust, very important in the workplace. But again, here are some ways that this can be done in the organizational environment. Provide time for social interaction, social activities. For example, just have lunch with colleagues instead of, closed door by yourself, unless you really need that me time. Strive for work-life integration or work-life balance. Take time to ask and learn about others' family, friends, and interests. And implement corporate social responsibility and volunteer programs that people can participate in. When I was at State, we had a local reading program and mentoring program for at-risk youth that we were allowed a certain amount of hours to work on every month. The financial, again, this is finding satisfaction with your current and financial situations. Money's an issue. It is one of the driving forces that we have, certainly in our culture, that can create stress and anxiety for people. And so, take advantage of financial literacy programs. I know several organizations actually bring in financial experts and advisors to the workforce to provide training in. Educate the workforce on financial programs and benefits, for like the public sector, the TSP and others. I recently had someone who used to work for me, at least 20 years ago. I got a ping on, I think it was LinkedIn, that the person had referred to me as one of the most important financial advisors. I was her supervisor, financial advisors, because I had educated my team on compound interest in the TSP and why it was useful for young folks to start investing right away. Provide financial counseling to the workforce. That can be done, not you personally, you want somebody that's professional. And incorporate other kinds of programs with grantee organizations or community organizations. Finally, occupational. Getting your personal satisfaction and enrichment from one's hobbies. And so again, here you can conduct values mapping. Do my personal values map to the organization's? Incorporate your passion and your learning into your daily work. Look for connections. Again, there was somebody I ran into who was an obsessive forensic files show watcher. And she was able to take what she learned from that show and apply it into her role in training. Create strengths-based learning organizational environment. Really, again, here, help your workforce focus on mastery of skills in what they do. And define your culture as one that accepts mistakes and failures as learning opportunities, not as gotchas, not as opportunities for blame and shame. I'm going to skip this. We'll talk about this. These questions we'll bring up in the Q&A. So I just want to kind of finish up really quickly here with best practices for engaging the workforce and planning. What you want to do is make sure that before, during, and after any planning process, you're doing these things. First thing is inform. Two-way communication is essential. And so here are just some suggestions. You can have organization-wide meetings, solicit input. one of the things that we did in both those agency stories that I shared with you earlier is we did focus groups around the country or work sessions with employees to have them give us a sense of what they thought the goals ought to be, based because they were frontline, based on what they knew was happening. And the amazing thing is that a lot of those things ended up being very similar across the country and really helping leadership focus more specifically on what should be done. And again, the way that that can be tested is develop those goals, share them around, get them out, get what people, their response to those. As you're going through the planning process, always have constant follow-up and feedback communication about the process, the progress, iterations that are happening. In agency number 2, there was a draft of the goals that was put out that was circulated to all employees, and then we held feedback sessions where employees who wanted to provide feedback could come in and openly talk about what they liked, what was missing, what they would change, to actually get that input in. And then after, you have to provide regular update on the progress of the goals. If you don't, again, those plans will just sit on the shelf and become credenza aware. Other things that can be done is you have progress charts posted publicly. We all, as agencies, of course, have our annual reports, but make sure those are used. Make sure those are communicated and gotten out. Again, you got to involve folks, and so you'll see a number of similar things here. What we did in these cases was we developed a steering committee to actually run the steering project. It was cross-functional and from different levels of the organization. So it included staff at the front line all the way up to senior executives. And then we developed goal teams so that they would have goal teams responsible for each goal. And then task forces that would follow up after the plan. And we could change the membership of those teams. And then again, after, again, have different versions available for different audiences. We had goal owners created, and we had those teams rotate members to monitor progress and communicate it in staff meetings. And then finally, build accountability and expertise by assessing and measuring your progress. So you know, in most plans, you're going to have what the performance measures are, kind of what targets are. Make sure those are clear. During the planning process, develop the action plans with who is responsible, when will things be done, what are the priorities, and what are the measures that you're going to use. And again, afterwards, regular review. Can't overemphasize that, that it's regular. Generally, every quarter, if not every month, even having town halls to talk about these things. So just something to think about. The role of healthy strategic planning for the public sector allows you to focus on these areas. Change. The major changes you want to make from where you are now to where you want to be, what your desired future is. What is that direction? What are the coordinates of it? Who are your customers? What are their expectations, wants, and needs? And how do you build in your work to meet those? What's the compliance you have to live with? Competition. Who else is doing similar things? Whether it's other countries, states, and how do you incorporate their best practices into what you do? And then most important, how do you communicate all of these things? And so just here, the very last slide is, as you go through the planning process, these are the so what questions. So if you ask yourself, so what? You know, Ted, you've spoken for an hour and a half, so what? Again, these are what you walk away with to define good, healthy planning. Who are we? Who do we want to be? What are we doing now? Who do we want to become? How do we answer the so what? So why do we exist? Why is that important? What do we need to start doing to get there? What do we need to continue doing? What do we need to stop doing? Is our culture ready to get us there? How will we know we're going the right direction and will have impact once we start implementing? And what are the ways we're going to increase the likelihood of success for the plan? So I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'll be here as long as you need.
Thank you so much, Ted. As we wait for more questions via the chat or the raise hand feature, I do have one question from Eric a while back. He asked, how do you deal with rapid change cycles that make strategic plans OBE very quickly?
Great question. I would match your planning process to those kinds of changes. So this can be done either through your kind of annual business or tactical or performance plans that you develop. What you're going to, because generally strategic plans are 4 to 5 years in length, but then you have an annual plan. When you're reviewing the annual plan, that is the time to look at what needs to get changed. However, when there's even more rapid change, if you're facing change that happens on a weekly or monthly basis, I would go at least once a quarter and go back to the plan to say, do we need to update? Is there something that needs to get changed? Does this completely make something OBE? And so you also then want to have kind of that rapid review process as well, and begin to tie that to what is that frequency of change that you experience.
Thank you so much, Ted. So we've had a lot of people commenting how meaningful this session has been, what a great training it was. A lot of people really appreciate the breakout session discussions. And if you want to personally share out your question, we invite you to do so via the raise hand feature at the bottom of your participants window. But if not, we will be happy to get any questions via Ted's email. Please feel free to email Ted if you have any questions. We'll be sending out the recording of this session early next week along with Ted's slides, so you have that available. Again, thank you so much, Ted, for being here today, and also thank you for everyone for joining in.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly.